swaddling just a custom that got propagated over time, or is there actual scientific evidence to support the custom? What are the benefits and risks of swaddling, and when should you stop swaddling? That's the topics that we're going to cover in this video. First, I'm going to cover the laboratory data on swaddling in infant sleep. I think this is the most relevant data to look at, and the aspect that parents are going to be most interested in is what does science actually say about infant sleep? So, and basically, yes, it has a benefit. They arouse less, startle less, wake up less, sleep longer, more likely to return to sleep on their own. And I particularly like the laboratory studies. I think while there is like the limitation, some of them are done during the day and for naps and not for nighttime sleep. I do think it's great how they can just collect so much data on sleep and it's more controlled. It's consistent how the swaddling is done and whether or not the baby's swaddled at all, which is a problem in some of the other studies. So, yeah, I think from a scientific perspective, it seems like it does improve baby sleep. And there are some other benefits as well, which I'll go over, that it soothes infants more easily. There does seem to be a few different lines of evidence that it helps soothe babies not as quickly as a pacifier does, but that it still does soothe them. It also, there's like one, maybe two studies that show that it improves the motor skills of preterm babies. And then this is obvious, but it does help keep babies warm. In my research on this, I did find a couple studies that didn't show significant effects. I'll give an example of one in particular that was a randomized controlled trial, which is usually the gold standard, which usually we would put more weight to. However, this was a at-home study which was based only on parental report data. And so if they had any bias about the efficacy of swaddling, that could definitely impact the quality of the data. And there was no other metric for measuring the quality of the infant's sleep. And then additionally, it was, we don't even know for sure that the babies were swaddled. The parents were just given, in the intervention group, the parents were just given a training on swaddling and then sent home. So it's possible that they weren't swaddling at all or weren't swaddling very effectively. Yeah, in summary, it seems like that there is a benefit to swaddling overall, although not every single study shows a significant effect. In addition to the scientific data, I think it's very relevant to discuss all of this in the context of the historical and anthropological data for which there's ample evidence to support swaddling. Given how nearly universal the practice is, it's hard to imagine that it's not effective. And it may have even evolved independently multiple times. There's one example that I think is really interesting, which is in North America, the use of cradle boards by the Navajo and other Native American tribes, where they would carry the baby around in this cradle board, and I'll show a picture of it. And I think it's just a really practical, useful tool for parents that, now that I'm a parent, seeing this picture, I think held a lot more meaning to me of like how immediately useful this would be. Because it keeps the baby contained. You can use it as a crib. You can use it to carry the baby. It keeps them swaddled so that they'll sleep better. And it's, when I compare that with all the baby devices that I used, it made me feel a little bit ridiculous by the number of different devices that I used, such as a stroller, a crib, a carrier, a car seat, etc. But sort of back to the main story, which is that so while swaddling is extremely prevalent, you don't see it as much in very hot and humid climates. For example, in Africa, where they tend to use baby slings more, and that swaddling can actually lead to skin infections if they're too hot. And then I will say, just on the historical side, it did kind of fall out of favor in sort of Western and Eastern Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries, because and this wasn't really based on any sort of data from my reading. It was really based more on this idea that it was unnatural, that it was like putting your baby in prison, that it would lead to permissive, submissive children, etc. But then I think probably because there's been like a reemergence, but I think in more recent decades, because it's useful and at least in the U.S., for my two kids, it definitely seemed like it was standard medical practice to do swaddling. While there are benefits to swaddling, there are also safety risks to keep in mind. Although, if done appropriately, swaddling should be very safe. The first kind of major risk, for which there seems to be quite a few studies looking at, is the how the risk of SIDS relates to swaddling. And there is a relationship there, and it's really important as parents that you do that right, which is that it can actually reduce the risk of SIDS if the baby's put on their back swaddled, and they cannot flip over in the swaddle. However, once they start to be able to flip over in the swaddle, if you don't remove the swaddle, that can increase the risk of SIDS. So that's just a very important thing to know, that you stop swaddling after they can flip around in the swaddle. However, you can use transitional swaddles, and I have a video planned where I go into some transitional swaddles options that are useful for parents. The other safety risk is hip dysplasia. It does seem like there's a few different lines of evidence that it does cause hip dysplasia, especially if there are other risk factors. But there's an easy way to avoid this, which is just that you only swaddle the arms and not the legs. And then there was another risk, which I was not expecting at all, that it can increase respiratory infections in babies. This is something that they haven't seen in Western cultures, but in Asia and a couple other China and a couple other countries, they have seen this increased risk of respiratory infections, and there are multiple studies on this topic. It's not totally clear what the link is and what's causing it, but it might have to do with potentially swaddling too tightly, and that has an issue on breathing and heart rate and things, and that could lead to increased respiratory infections. Or it could be, another theory is that it's due to a lack of vitamin D, because sometimes the swaddles kind of cover them so completely that they don't get any sunlight. And some places we tend to, in Western cultures, swaddle just it for sleep time, but I think in some cultures they swaddle the babies kind of a lot of the time or most of the day. Uh, so yeah, that was kind of an interesting fact. Don't know that it's relevant if you're in the Western culture and do it more in that tradition. But it was an interesting thing for which there is maybe a link there. And then another risk with swaddling, which also is a more obvious one, is that it could lead to overheating. The last topic I want to cover is when to start and stop swaddling. Particularly, I think parents are going to be interested in when to stop swaddling. But first, I'll start with when to start. So you can basically start almost immediately. Maybe you want to do skin to skin with the baby first. And in the hospitals, at least in the United States, it's very common to swaddle them like that first day, almost immediately. I will just mention, just in case there's an issue with this, I don't quite know how strong this really is. It seems kind of weak to me, the data on this. But there is this possible connection where if you start swaddling late, like 3 months plus, that there might be this connection with SIDS, because they saw sort of higher heart rates in kids that weren't used to swaddling being swaddled that was reminiscent of SIDS. But I don't know if a real connection there. Okay, so moving on to when to stop swaddling. Unfortunately, science doesn't have anything to offer on this topic. I think that would be a great area for future studies. And so we're left with looking at the anthropological data on this, which is useful, I think. So it looks like if you look across different cultures, most of them stop swaddling between about 3 months and 12 months. I would even narrow that down to 3 to 9 months. We stopped swaddling our kids in a transitional swaddle at 9 months, and they didn't have any issues with waking up or crying at night. And the idea there is that you can probably stop around that 9 month-ish mark because that's when babies outgrow the jerk reflex, which is what's waking them up at night when they're younger. I'd be curious, in the comments below, did any of you like what age did you stop swaddling, and did your kids have any issues with waking up when you stopped swaddling them? Because, science doesn't have a lot to offer, so maybe we can get some info here. And then the last thing I'll just mention on when to stop swaddling is you need to kind of stop swaddling. This is probably when most people stop swaddling, is when their babies roll over while swaddled. But that's going to be different for every baby, and you can use transitional swaddles, which is something that I'm going to talk about in a future video. So I hope you found this useful and or interesting.